The auction yard was loud that morning, the sound of boots scuffing across dry dirt, the chatter of men bargaining, and the nervous cries of animals penned in their stalls. But in the middle of all that noise, there was a smaller, trembling whisper from a little girl clutching the only ragged doll she had left. Her eyes were wide, red from crying, and when the auctioneer's hammer slammed down, she gasped and whispered words that pierced through the chaos. Sold. Like Mama was. She wasn't talking to anyone in particular. She was just remembering how her mother had been taken from her too soon, how everything familiar seemed to vanish one piece at a time, and now she was afraid that she too would be passed around like something to be claimed, something to be bought. The crowd hardly noticed her whisper. Men laughed. Horses neighed. The dust swirled. But those words, soft, trembling, soaked with fierce, seemed to hang in the air for someone who was listening closely. That someone was a man standing at the far end of the pen. His hat was pulled low over his brow, shadowing his face, but his eyes didn't leave the girl. He had come here that morning with no plans other than to check on some livestock and maybe head home before the sun got too hot. Yet now his boots wouldn't move. He stood still, watching her, wondering why this little one's sorrow struck his heart. Harder than anything else he'd heard in years. Life on the frontier was tough, and kindness was often buried beneath survival. Folks worked hard, fought harder, and kept to themselves. But sometimes, in the middle of all that hardship, moments arrived that forced a person to choose walk away like everyone else, or step forward into something that might change everything. This man, weathered by years of work on the land, found himself at that very crossroad. He could walk away, let her tears fade into the dust, and pretend it wasn't his concern. But his heart told him otherwise. The girl didn't look older than 8 or 9. Her hair hung uneven, as though it had been cut in a hurry. Her shoes didn't match, one laced tight, the other barely holding together. She looked too small for the oversized dress she wore, and her little shoulders hunched forward, as if she had already learned to expect the world to be heavy. The auctioneer called out prices, shouted numbers, and voices rose in response. But the girl wasn't listening to them. She clung to that doll, rocking it as if it were her only family left, whispering things too soft for most to hear. It was in that moment, as the hammer slammed down again, that the man's chest tightened. He wasn't one to act on impulse. He wasn't one to step into trouble unless he had no choice. But this felt different. This wasn't trouble. It was a cry for help. He could feel it. And deep inside, though he had never planned for such a thing, though he had never imagined raising a child, something inside him whispered, she doesn't need another loss. She needs a home. Still, the world was not so simple. A ranch was no place for a child, people would say. The work was endless, the risks constant. And this man, he wasn't known for soft words or gentle ways. He was a rancher, used to silence and sweat, used to being alone. Yet when the girl's trembling voice carried again, sold like Mama was, it felt like it wasn't just her speaking. It felt like life itself was asking him a question. The auction continued, but for him, everything else blurred. His mind wandered back to his own past, 2 memories of loss he never spoke about. 2 nights he had sat under the stars, wondering what it would mean to belong again. Maybe that was why her sorrow pierced him so deeply. Because he knew what it was like to feel alone, to feel like nobody was coming. And maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to change that story for someone else. The girl's eyes lifted for a moment, scanning the crowd. They were big, glassy, and searching, almost as though she was silently pleading for anyone to see her. Most folks turned away. It wasn't their business. But when her gaze landed on the man in the wide-brimmed hat, something stilled. For just a second, her breath caught. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know if he was safe, if he was kind, but she felt him watching. Not with the eyes of someone ready to claim or discard her, but with the eyes of someone torn between what is and what ought to be. He shifted his weight, his boots crunching against the gravel. The decision weighed heavy, like a storm cloud forming overhead. Could he step forward? Could he risk changing both their lives? He glanced toward the auctioneer, who had already moved on to the next lot. He looked back at the girl, her face pale but hopeful, even in her fear. And then he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a stirring deep inside, quiet but strong, telling him to act. The sun beat down hotter as the voices of buyers grew louder. The day carrying on, as if nothing remarkable was happening. Yet for the girl and the man, time seemed to slow. One was trembling in fear of being cast aside again, and the other was wrestling with the weight of a choice that could alter the course of both their lives. He took a step forward. Just one. But in that moment, dust rose beneath his boot, and the girl's eyes widened. A flicker of something new stirring in them, something dangerously close to hope. He didn't speak yet. He didn't call out. But the way his frame moved closer was enough to tell her she wasn't invisible, not this time. Her whisper returned, softer now, shaky but filled with wonder, until the rancher. She didn't finish the thought. She didn't dare. Because in her young heart, hope was fragile. She couldn't risk it breaking again. The man adjusted his hat, his hand brushing the brim as if steadying himself. His voice, low and steady, finally cut through the noise of the auction yard. Not a shout, not a bargain. Just a few words, spoken like a promise that even the wind seemed to carry. And in those words was the hint of something that could change everything. But what he said, what it meant for both of them, was only the beginning. Because sometimes family isn't found by blood, or Namit's found by a choice. In a moment when one soul dares to call another daughter, and as the dust settled on that hot morning, the girl's trembling lips parted, her heart caught between fear and hope, waiting to know if this time finally someone had chosen her. The auction yard carried on as though nothing unusual had happened. But for the girl and the rancher, every sound seemed distant, muted, like the world had slipped into a slower rhythm. The man's words, though few, had lingered in the air. Not yet clear enough for anyone nearby to understand, but sharp enough to sink deep into the girl's heart. She didn't know whether to believe what she thought she had, heard, or dismiss it as something her mind invented out of desperate hope. Her fingers tightened around her doll, and she lowered her eyes again, as if afraid to look too long at the man who had dared to notice her. The rancher didn't move closer right away. His boots stayed planted in the dirt, though his heart told him to step forward, to cut through the crowd and to end the girl's fear once and for all. But years of living alone had taught him caution. Words weren't promises unless you were ready to live them. And he wasn't sure if he was ready. His ranch sat miles out, quiet, rugged, with only the wind and the cattle for company. Bringing a child into that world was no small thing. He rubbed the back of his neck, wrestling with thoughts that wouldn't settle. While the auctioneer rattled off another sale, the girl glanced up again, her wide eyes tracing the tall figure of the man who seemed torn between leaving and staying. She didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but she saw something in him that others lacked. Most folks who passed her by carried eyes filled with quick judgments or indifference. But his eyes were heavy, thoughtful, almost as if he carried his own kind of sorrow. She couldn't explain it. Somehow she felt that his sadness spoke the same language as hers. Memories rushed through her as she stood there, half hidden by the crowd. She remembered her mama's voice, soft and warm, promising that no matter how hard things got, they would always have each other. But promises don't always hold against the weight of life. Illness had swept her mama away, leaving the girl with nothing but the sound of that fading voice and a doll stitched together from scraps. She remembered the day she was brought here, the day she realized she had no say in where she would go next, no say in who might claim her. The world was bigger than her, louder, harsher, and she felt small enough to vanish in it. The rancher shifted again, his jaw tightening as the girl's whisper replayed in his mind. Sold, like Mama was. The words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. They weren't just about her. They were about something he himself understood. Long ago, before the calluses, before the endless work, he had known what it was like to lose everything that felt safe. He had known what it was to stand in a world that didn't seem to care. He had learned to build walls, to protect himself from ever feeling that exposed again. But now, looking at her, he realized those walls might not be strong enough to ignore what was right in front of him. The auctioneer called for the next round of bids. his voice booming and drawing the crowd's attention. Men raised their hands, shouts of numbers filled the air, and the little girl flinched at each slam of the hammer. To her, every sound felt like a reminder of what could happen, that she might soon be taken by someone with no care for her. Someone who saw her as nothing more than a burden or a task. Her heart pounded, and she rocked her doll against her chest, whispering words no one else could hear. The man finally moved, though not with the boldness of someone ready to claim her. He stepped slowly, weaving his way closer, but still hung back, as though testing his own resolve. He didn't speak to her. Not yet. Instead, he studied her quietly, taking in every detail, weighing what it might mean if he made a choice here that he couldn't undo later. His life had been carved out of silence and hard work. He had no gentle hand for braiding hair, no soft touch for bedtime stories. All he had was the ranch, the cattle, the soil, and the long, lonely days that filled them. Could that be enough for her? Could he be enough? The girl felt his presence draw nearer, and she dared a quick glance. Her lips parted as if she wanted to ask something, but no words came. Children learn quickly when the world has been unkind, and she had already learned that questions often went unanswered. Still, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that looked almost like hope, though it trembled as though it might break at any moment. Around them, the yard grew busier. Wagons rolled, men shouted, dust rose in heavy clouds. It was easy for most to overlook the tiny drama unfolding in the corner, but for the man and the girl, it felt as though the rest of the world had faded, leaving just the two of them standing on the edge of something unknown. The rancher's hand brushed against the worn leather of his belt, his thoughts storming inside. He remembered his own father's rough voice, a man of few words but firm convictions. A man's worth, his father had once said, ain't in the land he holds, or the cattle he runs. It's in what he chooses when the hard choices come. He hadn't thought about that in years. Yet here he was, standing before one of those very choices. The girl's stomach rumbled faintly, sound she tried to hide by pressing her doll tighter. She hadn't eaten since the small crust of bread they gave her at sunrise. Hunger wasn't new to her, but it still pressed against her ribs like a constant reminder of what she lacked. She looked again at the man in the hat, studying him as if trying to decide whether he was the kind of person who would turn away once he learned how much care she needed. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the yard. The day's heat was settling, but the tension in the air between them was just beginning. The man wanted to speak, to step forward fully and end this waiting. But the words clung to his throat, heavy with the weight of what they might mean. He wasn't sure if he was ready to carry the burden of being more than just a rancher, more than just a solitary figure living in the dust. And yet, with each second he delayed, he saw the hope dim a little in her eyes. It was faint, but it was there. The way her shoulders sank slightly, the way her gaze dropped to the ground again, as though she had begun to believe he was no different than the rest. That realization stung deeper than he expected. Still, he hesitated, because choices like this weren't just for a moment, they lasted a lifetime. The crowd began. Too thin as the last sales were made, men leading their animals away, wagons creaking as they rolled out of the yard. The girl remained where she was, unmoving, waiting, though she didn't dare admit she was waiting for him. The rancher stayed too, as if some unseen rope bound him there. Neither spoke, neither moved closer. But both felt the pull between them. The girl closed her eyes briefly, whispering again to the doll in her arms. "Don't leave me too." It was faint, carried only a short distance, but the man heard it. His heart twisted, and for the first time in a long while, he felt his carefully built walls start to crack. But still, he didn't speak the words she longed to hear. Not yet. He only stood there, caught between the life he had always known and the life that might be waiting if he dared to take a step further, and so the day began to fade, the dust settling into silence, leaving only the unanswered question hanging in the space between them, a question that neither of them could yet bring themselves to ask aloud. Night fell heavy on the town, the kind of night when stars glimmered sharp against the dark, and the air turned cool enough to remind folks of the silence waiting beyond the fences. The rancher rode back slow, his horse steady on the dirt road. The sound of hooves echoed faintly, but his thoughts were louder, circling like restless winds. He told himself he'd gone to the auction yard for cattle, maybe a few supplies, nothing more. Yet the image that clung to him wasn't of livestock or prices, it was of a little girl with eyes too old for her years and a voice that had whispered, "Sorrow," into the dust. He reached his ranch just as the moon climbed high, casting silver over the fields. The land stretched wide, quiet, broken only by the lowing of cattle and the creak of the barn door in the wind. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel, stood still for a long while, listening to the familiar sounds of his life. Normally they brought comfort, but tonight they felt different. They felt empty. The ranch had always been enough for him, but now it seemed to echo with questions he didn't know how to answer. Inside the small cabin, the lantern flickered, shadows stretching across the wooden walls. He sat at the table, the silence pressing down. The girl's words haunted him, sold like Mama was. He couldn't shake the way her voice had cracked, the way her small shoulders had folded inward as though she carried more weight than her frame could bear. He rubbed his hands over his face, wrestling with the truth he didn't want to face. That child was alone, and he had walked away. But he hadn't truly left her behind, not in his heart. He could still see the way her eyes had followed him, that thin thread of hope she had tried to hide. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling beams. Could he take her in? Could he be what she needed? Doubt gnawed at him. He was no father, no gentle hand. He had buried his softness long ago, when loss had taught him the danger of caring too deeply. The ranch was hard, and life here took more than it gave. What right did he have to pull a child into it? Meanwhile, in town, the girl sat curled up in a corner of the boarding house. She had been placed there until someone decided what to do with her, though the voices of men earlier had made it sound more like waiting for another transaction. Her doll lay against her cheek, and she whispered to it, just as she always had, when fear felt too large. "He saw us," she told the doll, her voice low. "He didn't walk away." Not all the way. The words were fragile, like threads spun too thin, but they were all she had. She thought of her mama, of the promises that had faded with sickness, and wondered if people could ever truly keep their word. She had been told more than once that she was a burden, that her place was wherever she was put. Yet something about the man in the hat made her wonder if maybe there could be more. She didn't know why his eyes had felt different, but she clung to that difference now, even if it was only her imagination. Back at the ranch, sleep didn't come easy. He turned over in bed, listening to the howl of coyotes in the distance. Every sound seemed to bring her face back to him. The memory of her hunger, her small hands gripping that doll at all, gnawed at him like a restless wolf at the edge of his thoughts. He had seen plenty of orphans, plenty of hard stories. He had told himself long ago that a man couldn't carry every sorrow of the world on his back, but this wasn't the world. This was one child, and she wasn't fading from his mind the way others had. The next morning he rose before the sun, the way he always did. He saddled his horse and worked through the chores, feeding the animals, checking the fences, filling the troughs. The tasks were the same, but his rhythm was off. Every time he bent down or lifted a bucket, he imagined what it might be like, with small footsteps trailing behind. A little voice asking questions, or maybe just the quiet presence of someone who needed him. That thought unsettled him, yet it lingered. The townsfolk had begun to talk too. The girl wasn't invisible, though most didn't bother to see her beyond what trouble she might bring. A few whispered that she'd likely be sent off to work in some kitchen or taken in by folks who needed an extra hand more than they wanted a child. Some shook their heads, saying it wasn't right for a girl so young to be passed along like that. Others shrugged, muttering that the world was hard, and she'd learn soon enough how to endure it. But among the whispers came something else, a question of whether the rancher had looked at her longer than most. A few had noticed. He wasn't known for lingering in town or paying attention to anyone but his work. And yet that day, he hadn't left as quickly as usual. The gossip was quiet, but it spread, tugging at him, even when he tried to ignore it. He told himself he had no reason to care what others thought. Yet deep down, he knew their words weren't the problem. The problem was the girl's face, still fixed in his memory, still waiting. The conflict grew inside him, pulling in two directions. On one side was the life he had always known, the solitude, the land, the hard work that left no room for anything else. On the other side was a child, fragile but fierce in her own way, waiting to see if someone would choose her. The decision pressed at him like a weight, heavy and unrelenting, and while he wrestled with his doubts, the girl wrestled with her own. Each day that passed without him returning chipped away at her hope. She tried not to expect anything, tried to tell herself not to be foolish, but every time the door opened, her heart lifted before sinking again when it wasn't him. She wondered if maybe she had imagined the kindness in his eyes. Maybe she had only seen what she wanted to see. Yet even in her doubt, she whispered again to her doll, the same words she had said before, "Don't leave me too." Her small voice trembled, carrying into the silence of the night, unanswered, but not forgotten. The rancher lay awake again, staring at the ceiling beams of his cabin, knowing that silence would not be enough much longer. He could keep ignoring the pull in his chest, keep pretending that the girl was just another sorrow to walk away from. But deep down, he knew this conflict wasn't going away. It was only growing stronger, louder, until it would force him to choose. And when dawn broke once more, spilling gold across the wide plains, both the girl and the man carried the same unspoken question. How much longer could hope wait before it was lost? The days that followed moved slow for the girl, but every hour felt heavier for the rancher. Each morning he rose before the sun, tending to the ranch as he always had, but nothing felt the same. The silence pressed harder. The chores, once steady and grounding, now left his mind restless. Each moment he saw her face, small, pale, filled with fear, yet holding on to that fragile thread of hope. He told himself to forget, to keep to his work, but the more he tried to silence the thought, the louder it became. In town, the girl's world grew smaller with each passing day. The boarding house kept her sheltered, but not safe from whispers. Some spoke of sending her off with a family far away, one that would take her not out of love but because an extra pair of hands meant less work for themselves. Others muttered that she might end up bound to a stranger's house, her childhood swallowed by endless chores. She listened quietly, never asking questions, but every word burned into her heart. She held her doll tighter at night, whispering stories into its fabric, pretending her mama could still hear. But the real storm wasn't just around her, it was in the town itself. A family, known more for their sharp tempers than their kindness, had started showing interest. They spoke loud enough for others to hear, saying a girl her age would be useful. Their eyes didn't carry warmth when they looked at her. They carried hunger, like someone eyeing a tool they planned to use until it broke. The girl felt it, even if she didn't fully understand it. She shrank away whenever they came close, clutching her doll as if it could shield her. Word of this reached the rancher before long. He overheard it at the general store, careless comment about how the girl wouldn't be waiting much longer. He froze, the can of coffee in his hand suddenly heavy. His heart thudded, the weight of choice pressing harder than ever before. He couldn't ignore it now. He could walk away, yes, but walking away meant leaving her to a fate he already knew too well. That thought haunted him. That night, back at his cabin, the wind howled against the windows, rattling them as if urging him to act. He sat by the fire, staring at the flames, his father's words echoing again. A man's worth shows in the hard choices. He clenched his fists, knowing he stood at the edge of one. The girl, meanwhile, lay in her narrow bed at the boarding house, the creak of footsteps in the hallway stirring her fears. She thought of the rancher, wondering if she had imagined the way his eyes had lingered on her, the way his presence had felt different from all the rest. She wanted to believe he would come back, but each passing day dimmed that hope. "Don't leave me too," she whispered to her doll, her small voice breaking in the dark. The tension in town thickened as the family pressed harder to take her. The boarding house matron, tired and overworked, began leaning toward, letting them have their way. "At least she'll have a roof," the woman muttered. Though her eyes avoided the girl's, the decision was drawing closer. And with it, the girl's fear grew sharper. The rancher couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the look of dread on her face, heard the faint quiver of her whisper. He rose in the dark hours before dawn, pacing his cabin, torn between the life he knew and the life that seemed to be reaching out for him. His chest ached with the weight of it, the choice clawing at him like a storm that refused to pass. Morning came, with it the sound of hooves echoing across the empty road. The rancher rode into town, his hat low, his jaw tight. Each clop of his horse's hooves felt heavier, dragging him closer to a moment he both dreaded and couldn't avoid. The townsfolk watched as he passed, murmurs rising behind him. They knew where he was headed, or at least they thought they did. The girl sat in the boarding house corner, her doll pressed against her chest when the door opened. Her eyes flickered up wide, catching sight of the familiar figure framed in the doorway. Her breath caught, her tiny hands gripping tighter, as though the whole world balanced on whether he would take another step. But before he could move closer, the family that had set their eyes on her stepped forward too. Their voices rose, firm and demanding, claiming they had rights to her now, that she belonged with them. The room filled with noise, words sharp as knives. The girl shrank back, her heart racing, her gaze darting between them and the rancher. The air grew thick with tension, the kind that makes every heartbeat sound louder, every breath sharper. The rancher's hand tightened at his side, his eyes fixed on the child who was watching him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. And in that charged moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which way the weight would fall toward the family whose hands reached for her out of need, or toward the rancher whose silence had already spoken louder than words. The fire crackled in the hearth. The boards creaked beneath shifting boots, and the girl's whisper slipped through the noise, trembling but clear, "Please." And then the room froze. Balanced on the edge of a choice that would change everything, the room stayed silent for a breath that felt like a lifetime. The girl's pleas hung there like a tiny lantern in a storm, and every eye turned to the rancher. He took one slow step forward, then another, his boots sounding steady on the wooden floor. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he finally spoke, it was with the kind of calm that makes people listen. He said he had a place for her. He said he would see to her care. He said he wasn't leaving her. And then softer, with a tremor even, he couldn't hide, said, "Daughter, if you'll have me." A hush rolled through the room. The family that had pushed for her shifted, their claim wilting under the weight of something they didn't carry, real promise. The boarding house matron peered over her apron, lines of worry softening. Someone at the back whispered that a child needed more than chores and hard hands. The rancher took out a folded paper, simple, not grand, signed by the town clerk and witnessed by the pastor. He had ridden before dawn to get it done. He wasn't a man for grand speeches, but he knew what had to be in order. He had set it in order. The family argued a little more, their voices thin now. They said the ranch was far, the work rough. The rancher met their eyes without anger. He said work would never be the measure of her worth. He said a home wasn't built on what a child could do for it, but on what the grown folk would do for the child. The matron cleared her throat and nodded once. She had seen enough to know the truth when it stood in front of her. The room exhaled. The rancher held out his hand. The girl looked up, searching his face, and found no hurry there, no push. Only a steady, patient waiting. She rose, clutching her worn doll, and slipped her small hand into his. They walked out into the bright noon, as if the town has been holding its breath for just this moment. The street noise returned, the usual clatter of wagons and voices, but it felt different now, cleaner somehow. The rancher lifted her onto the horse and swung up behind her, keeping one arm firm around her middle. The ride out of town was quiet. A hawk circled high. The land stretched wide and clear. She kept the doll in her lap and watched the road unwind, the dust trailing behind them like a past they were choosing to leave where it belonged. When the ranch came into view, she sat a little taller. The fence rails looked straight and sure. The windmill clicked softly as it turned. The cabin was small but solid, its porch catching a patch of sun. He helped her down and led her to the door, pausing at the threshold as if he, too, was entering a new place. Inside, the room smelled of wood smoke and coffee. It was spare table, chairs, a stove, a shelf with a few books, but there was nothing harsh about it. He had set a tin cup by a plate and laid an extra blanket on the bed in the corner. He hadn't known if she would come, but he had prepared anyway. They ate bread and stew in a quiet that didn't feel empty. He showed her the small chest where she could put her doll at night. He pointed to the peg where her dress could hang. He spoke softly, careful with each word, as if building a bridge one plank at a time. When she looked at the door, nervous at the newness of it all, he said, "It shuts from the inside, and it opens from the inside. This is your home." She touched the latch, then the table, as though testing the shape of belonging. That evening, the sky burned orange and pink before slipping into a deep blue. He took her out to the fence line and taught her how to listen for the cattle, how to tell the sound of wind through grass from the warning of a stray branch. She didn't speak much, but her eyes followed everything. He showed her a corner of the barn he'd swept that morning, a place to keep her shoes and the little treasures children gather, a smooth stone, a feather, a ribbon. These were small things, but they were the start of a life. The days began to take on a rhythm. Morning light spilled through the small window, and she learned the sound of the kettle warming. He taught her to stack kindling, to draw water, to wash her hands before meals. In return, she taught him how to hear a question before it was spoken, to notice when a story wanted telling, to pause for the small joys a sparrow's hop, a cloud shaped like a horse. He mended a shelf lower so she could reach her cup. She set a wildflower in a jar on the table, and the cabin felt different lived in. Somehow softer, word traveled fast across the frontier. The town talked, as towns do. There were those who doubted a ranch as no place for a child, they said. But doubt grew quieter each time the pair rode in together for supplies, the girl sitting steady in the saddle. The rancher carrying an extra loaf and an apple he let her choose herself, the boarding house matron. Seeing the way the child's cheeks had filled out and the fear had eased from her eyes, gave a small nod whenever they passed. Even the family that had once pressed their claim let the matter fade. Some things argue themselves. There was one corner of the ranch the girl hadn't gone yet. A small patch beneath a cottonwood where the grass grew long and the wind seemed to hush. One afternoon, the rancher walked her there. He knelt and traced a hand across a stone set into the earth. He told her in simple words that he had known loss too. Years back, sickness had come, quiet and fast, and the house had gone silent in a way that took years to soften. He didn't say more than he needed to. He didn't have to. The girl stood close, her doll pressed to her side, and set a wildflower on the stone without being asked. The rancher's shoulders lifted and fell. The space between them changed from kindness to kinship. Trust took root in the small, daily ways. He asked before moving her doll. She asked before feeding the barn cat. He stopped in the doorway to say good night. She answered every time, good night. In the mornings, he would find a tiny trail of pebbles she'd lined up along the porch rail, like a parade. In the evenings, she would find the fire stacked and ready, a skillet waiting for warm bread. These were the stitches of a home pulled through and through until they held. Seasons turned as seasons do. The ranch taught her the honest rhythm of work and rest, of care and being cared for. There were still hard days. A fence post broke in a windstorm. A calf strayed and took hours to find. There were nights when old sadness rose like a tide, when the girl woke and sat up listening to the dark. But on those nights, the rancher lit the small lamp and sat on the chair by her bed, speaking low about the wind, about the cattle, about the stars, keeping their places even when clouds hid them. He didn't promise a world without sorrow. He promised presence. It was enough. As time folded into itself, the town began to use new words when they spoke of them. They said the orphan had a father now. They said the rancher had a daughter. They said family, and it fit. At the auction yard where their story had begun, men still haggled, boots still scuffed the dust. But sometimes, passing that gate, the rancher slowed his horse, and the girl squeezed his arm with a gentle certainty. She would look at him and smile, and he would tip his hat to the memory of a day that had asked a question and received an answer. On a bright spring morning, under a sky so clear it looked washed, they rode into town not for supplies, but for papers. The clerk, who saw more ledgers than lives, smiled anyway as he stamped the final page. The pastor, who had witnessed the first promise made without words, stood nearby and gave a quiet blessing. There was no grand speech, just a truth spoken plain. What started as a rescue had become a home. The girl, holding her doll in one arm and the rancher's hand in the other, breathed a long, careful breath, as if setting down something heavy she'd carried too long. They celebrated in their own small weight 2 biscuits, honey, and a walk past the livery where a foal had been born the night before. The girl laughed, a sound bright and whole. The rancher laughed too, the sound rusty at first, then sure. In the general store window, they caught their reflection by accident, a tall shadow and a small one, standing side by side. They looked like people who belonged where they stood. Back at the ranch that evening, the sky turned gold and the wind softened. He fixed a new sign on the gate, no flashy words, just the ranch's mark burned neat into the wood. He asked if she wanted to add anything. She touched the warm grain, thinking. Then she drew a tiny heart with the end of a twig and he let it be. The mark of the place was his. The heart was theirs. Before night settled, they walked again to the cottonwood. The girl set another wildflower by the stone. The rancher stood with his hat in his hands. The air felt full of quiet things. Thank yous, good nights were still here. On the way back, she slipped her hand into his without looking. He gave a small squeeze, and neither spoke. Because some words are truest when they're held rather than said. The story of the auction yard, the orphan, and the rancher didn't end with a single moment. It ended with many, layered like rings in a tree. Breakfasts made, fences mended, worries shared, laughter found. It ended with the understanding that family on the frontier could be forged not by blood but by brave, daily choosing. It ended with a house that was still small but no longer silent. With a table that always had room for one more bowl. With a porch that caught every dawn like a promise kept for those who heard it later through town talk, through a heartwarming YouTube video retelling, through a story passed from one porch to another. The takeaway was simple and lasting. In a world that can be loud with buying and selling, there is a different kind of word that changes everything. Chosen. A child chosen. A father chosen. A home chosen. That is the quiet power that outlives the dust of any auction yard. And on clear nights, when the stars pricked the sky and the windmill clicked in its old, faithful rhythm, the rancher would lean in the doorway, and the girl would curl on the step with her doll in a blanket, and the ranch would hum with a steady peace. They had not outrun sorrow. They had outlived it together. He would say good night, and she would answer the same 2 words every time. Full now, sure now, whole now. Good night, Dad.